Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, I want to challenge the way a lot of hunters think about elk because after more than 3 decades of hunting Western public land, one truth has become impossible for me to ignore. Most elk hunts don't fail because of bad timing, quiet rut activity, or unpredictable behavior. They fail because hunters misunderstand terrain. We're conditioned to ask the wrong questions. Where did the elk go? Why did they stop bugling? Why were they here yesterday and gone today? But those questions assume that elk are constantly changing their minds. In reality, elk don't need to do much at all. They need to feed, bed, stay alive, and avoid pressure. And terrain, not mood, not magic, or not luck, decides how they do those things. When you understand terrain, the hunt's going to slow down for you in a good way. You're going to stop chasing sounds, fresh tracks, and last night's stories. And you're going to stop burning energy reacting to movement that already happened. Instead, you're going to start positioning yourself where elk are most likely to move before they ever show up. That's the difference between hoping and hunting. In this episode, I'm going to walk you through a major reframe. Stop trying to predict elk behavior and start predicting terrain decisions. We're going to talk about why elk feel so random to average hunters, how terrain quietly funnels movement even under heavy pressure, and why bedding terrain, not feeding areas, becomes the anchor during hunting season. We'll break down the terrain features that consistently create opportunity, how pressure changes everything, and why most hunters get caught reacting instead of intercepting. By the end of this episode, you're going to be able to look at a piece of country and quickly identify where elk are most likely to travel, hide, and survive without needing perfect timing or nonstop vocal activity. This isn't about hunting harder. It's about hunting smarter by letting terrain do the predicting for you. One of the biggest mistakes a lot of hunters make is assuming elk are constantly doing something dramatic. We talk about them like they're unpredictable, emotional, or reactive to every little change in weather, moon phase, or rut timing. But the truth is, elk win by doing the simplest things possible over and over again. And elk's daily priorities are basic. Feed enough to maintain energy. Bed in a place that feels safe. Use terrain and wind to detect danger. Avoid pressure. That's it. They are not out there improvising. They are solving the same survival problems every single day, and they choose the easiest, safest, most efficient way to do that based on terrain. This is where the myth of unpredictable elk behavior comes from. Hunters see elk move differently from one day to the next and assume the elk changed. In reality, pressure changed. Maybe wind changed or human presence changed. Terrain didn't change. Elk simply adjusted within the same terrain system to stay alive. What actually repeats is comfort, security, and efficiency. Elk want beds that give them wind advantage and visibility. They want travel routes that minimize their exposure. They want feeding areas they can access without crossing wide open danger zones. When those needs are met, elk don't wander far or behave erratically. They settle into patterns that make sense for that specific piece of country. Where hunters go wrong is over focusing on events, right? Especially during the rut. Bugles, chasing, fights, satellites running around. Those moments are exciting, but they're the exception, not the foundation. The daily cycle still exists underneath the rut noise. Elk still bed in secure terrain. They still travel along terrain features that protect them. They still use the same escape routes when pressure shows up. When you hunt only the events, you end up chasing yesterday's excitement. When you hunt the cycle, you start showing up ahead of the elk instead of behind them. This is why some hunters consistently find elk even when it feels dead to everybody else. They aren't relying on activity alone, they're relying on structure. They understand that elk don't need perfect conditions to move, they just need terrain that solves their problems better than the alternatives. Once you accept that elk don't need to do much, the hunt becomes less emotional and more deliberate. You stop forcing movement and start asking better questions. Not what are the elk doing today, but Where would an elk choose to be if survival was the only goal? That mindset shift is where consistent success actually begins. If elk are solving problems, then terrain is the board those decisions get played out on. Terrain controls almost everything that matters in an elk hunt: what elk can see, where they can move, how they can use wind and thermals, and how they can escape when pressure shows up. Behavior is just the result of those constraints. Elk don't pick locations at random. They choose terrain that makes life easier, places that offer cover without trapping them, travel routes that allow efficient movement without exposing them, bedding areas that combine wind advantage, sight lines, and multiple escape options. When you understand those things, elk behavior stops looking mysterious and starts looking more logical. This is also where the difference between elk country and kill country shows up. Elk country is everywhere elk can live. Kill country is where terrain forces movement into predictable space that a hunter can actually capitalize on. A giant basin full of elk might look incredible on a map, but if there's no structure that controls how those elk move, it's hard to convert sightings into opportunities. On the flip side, a narrow timbered bench, a saddle with consistent wind flow, or a broken side hill with multiple micro features might not hold elk all day, but it creates moments where elk have to pass through in a certain way. Terrain also creates predictability even when elk seem random. 2 days of hunting the same area can feel completely different to the average hunter. No bugles, no visible movement, nothing makes sense. But if you look at it through a terrain lens, the explanation is usually pretty simple. Wind shifted and elk slid to the downwind side of the same ridge. Pressure increased and elk dropped into a lower bench with better escape routes. Thermals changed and bedding moved 50 yards, not 5 miles. This is why chasing behavior fails a lot of times. Behavior is fluid, but terrain is fixed. When you anchor your decisions to behavior, you're always reacting to something that already happened. When you anchor your decision to terrain, you're positioning for what has to happen. Think of terrain as a series of problems and solutions layered across the landscape. Where can elk bed with security? Where can they travel without being seen? Where can they feed without getting trapped? Every answer is written into the ground itself. Your job isn't to outguess the elk, it's to read the board better than other hunters. Once you start seeing terrain this way, you stop bouncing around the mountain looking for signs of life, and you start committing to places that consistently produce encounters. That's the shift from wandering through elk country to intentionally hunting kill country, and it's one of the biggest separators between a lot of the average hunters out there and the consistently successful ones. Elk don't move across the landscape evenly. Even in big open country, their movement gets shaped, sometimes forced, by terrain. This is where funnels come into play. Funnels aren't just obvious saddles or narrow passes. They're any terrain feature that reduces options and quietly nudges elk into predictable paths. Saddles, benches, finger ridges, timber bands, burns, creek bottoms, rims, just to name a few. Each of those features solves a different problem for elk. Saddles offer efficient travel between drainages without dropping elevation. Benches provide flat, secure travel and bedding with escape routes above and below. Finger ridges break wind and sight lines while allowing downhill travel without committing to the bottom. Timber bands offer cover and thermal stability. Burns create feed and visibility. Creek bottoms offer shade, water, and travel lanes that stay hidden longer than open slopes. What matters isn't the feature itself, it's how that terrain feature limits choice. A true funnel is a place where elk movement becomes more likely, not because elk want to be there, but because the alternatives are worse: steeper ground, worse wind, more exposure, more pressure. Elk choose the path of least resistance that still keeps them safe. Step into the backcountry and step up your elk hunting game at Elk Camp 2026. This isn't a seminar, it's an immersive experience with real field training alongside successful elk hunters Matt and Saxton Hartsky. You'll learn how elk think and move, break down terrain like a pro, call with confidence, and practice 3 days of real-world elk hunting scenarios that mirror what you'll face on your own hunt. This camp was built to bridge the gap between where you are and where you want to be in the mountains. With limited spots and hands-on coaching, you'll walk away sharper, more prepared, and ready to hunt with purpose and confidence. Elk Camp 2026. Sharpen your edge. Register now and prepare for the season like never before at backboneunlimited.com. This is also why micro-terrain beats big terrain almost every time. Big terrain gets a lot of attention, but small features get overlooked. A subtle bench that only runs 100 yards, a slight fold in a side hill that hides movement, a narrow strip of dark timber between two open faces. These are the places elk slip through while hunters glass past them or walk right over the top. The key is learning to separate funnels from random crossings. A random crossing is convenient but optional. A funnel removes options. You can identify the difference by asking simple questions. Does this feature connect two resources elk need? Does it offer better cover or wind than the surrounding ground? Does it avoid exposure or pressure? If the answer is yes to multiple questions, movement becomes more predictable there. Another mistake hunters make is assuming funnels are only travel routes. In reality, funnels can also be used for short distance daily movement like sliding from feed to bed, shifting with the thermals, or repositioning under pressure. These movements might only cover a few hundred yards, but they happen repeatedly because terrain keeps forcing the same decision. When you start seeing how terrain funnels elk choices, you stop guessing where elk might go and start understanding where they're most likely to go. That's when setups get cleaner, sits get more patient, and encounters start feeling less random and more earned. One of the fastest ways to struggle on pressured public land is to hunt feed without understanding where elk bed. Feeding areas get all the attention because they're easy to identify. Meadows, burns, parks, and openings show up clearly on maps and through your glass. But once hunting pressure exists, feed becomes secondary. Bedding terrain becomes the anchor that everything else revolves around. During hunting season, elk don't ask, where is the best feed? They ask, where can I survive the day? That answer is almost always tied to bedding security. Elk choose beds that give them multiple advantages at once. Wind they can trust, cover that hides movement, sight lines that allow early detection, and escape routes that don't force them into open danger. This is why simply finding feed fails so often. On public land, elk may feed briefly in exposed areas at night or during low pressure windows, but they won't commit to those same places once people are moving. Instead, they feed closer to bedding cover and they shorten the distance between feed and bed until exposure is really minimized. The more pressure increases, the tighter that relationship between feed and bed becomes. Good bedding terrain often looks unimpressive at first glance. Broken side hills with mixed cover, benches tucked below rims, north-facing timber just off a feeding slope. Those areas don't scream elk, but they quietly check every survival box. Wind tends to be more stable. Thermals work in the elk's behavior, and escape routes exist in multiple directions. This is also where hunting the space between bedding and feed becomes far more effective than hunting either one directly. These are the transition zones I've talked about a lot in other videos. When you sit on feed, you're relying on timing and low pressure. When you push into bedding, you're risking blowing elk out before legal light or forcing them to relocate entirely. The transition zone, that's it, baby. The first safe terrain elk enter after feeding or the last terrain they use before feeding offers movement for you that's both predictable and huntable. Elk don't need to travel far if their needs are met. In pressured units, that distance often shrinks to a few hundred yards. Hunters who overlook bedding terrain assume elk disappeared, where in reality, the elk just tightened their footprint and shifted deeper into terrain that favors them. Once you start prioritizing bedding terrain, your entire approach is going to change. You stop covering miles just to check feed areas. You slow down. You watch terrain that elk are reluctant to leave, and instead of chasing elk that vanished overnight, you start hunting elk that were there the whole time, just using terrain to stay alive. Hunters love to explain success and failure through rut timing. Early September, peak rut, late rut, but on public land, pressure almost always matters more than the calendar. You can have perfect rut conditions on paper and still struggle if pressure pushes elk into terrain that neutralizes your approach. Pressure changes where elk go, how they move, and when they move. Increased human pressure doesn't just make elk spookier, it reshapes their daily footprint. Elk shift into terrain that absorbs pressure, places that are hard to access, uncomfortable to hunt, or simply overlooked. Steep side hills, dead end basins, thick timber below trails, awkward angles that don't glass well, deadfall. These aren't random choices. They're deliberate survival moves driven by terrain. This is why the same unit can hunt completely different from one year to the next. More tags, better access, more social media exposure, more hunters willing to hike further. None of those things change the terrain, but they change how elk use them. Areas that once produced daylight movement suddenly go quiet, not because elk left the unit, but because pressure pushed them into terrain that favors escape over exposure. This is where the idea of pressure terrain becomes critical. Some terrain absorbs hunters. Roads, trails, easy ridges, wide open basins. These features funnel people just as predictably as they funnel elk. Other terrain hides elk. Side hills below travel corridors, short, ugly climbs nobody wants to make, timber pockets with poor visibility that discourage lingering. Elk learn these patterns faster than a lot of hunters realize. Pressure and terrain interact constantly. Elk don't just run away from pressure, they reposition within terrain systems that allow them to detect, avoid, and escape it. A basin that looks empty from above might be full of elk tucked into benches below the rim. A ridge that gets walked daily might push elk one contour line down into secure timber that never gets hunted. When pressure increases, movement windows shrink. Elk move earlier, later, or shorter distances. They use the same funnels, but they do it faster and quieter. Hunters who rely on bugles and visible activity think the elk vanished. Hunters who understand pressure terrain adjust their setups and stay in the game. Once you stop blaming slow action on rut timing and start accounting for pressure, your expectations become realistic and your decisions become sharper. You don't abandon good terrain because it's quiet. You refine how and when you hunt, and that's often the difference between burning days and creating one high quality opportunity that actually matters, being in the right place at the right time. When elk hunting gets hard, most hunters fall into the same trap. They start chasing movement, a bugle over the ridge, fresh tracks crossing a trail, a glimpse of elk slipping through timber. It feels productive to react, to move, to do something, but most of the time that reaction puts you one step behind elk instead of in front of them. Movement is usually the result of something, not the cause. Elk move because terrain funnels them, pressure forces them, or wind and thermals shift their advantage. When you chase movement without understanding why it happened, you're responding to the aftermath, not the decision. By the time you get there, the elk have already solved the problem and moved on. That's why reacting to bugles is so dangerous. Bugles are information, not invitations. A bull sounding off doesn't mean he's killable. It means he's located in terrain that allows him to vocalize safely at that moment. The second pressure changes, that same bull can shut down and reposition without traveling far at all. Hunters who charge toward sound randomly often push elk into better terrain instead of intercepting them. The positioning mindset flips this completely. Instead of asking, where are the elk right now? You ask, where do elk have to move through if they're solving survival problems? Positioning is about being early, not fast. It's about setting up in places that force elk to reveal themselves rather than hoping to catch them in the open. This is also how you stay effective when elk go silent. Silence doesn't mean absence. It means elk are using terrain and pressure to their advantage. Hunters who rely on noise panic and overmove. Hunters who rely on position sit longer, glass smarter, and let terrain do the work. They understand that quiet elk still need to travel travel, shift beds, and manage wind. And those movements are controlled by the same terrain features every single day. Another reason a lot of average hunters chase movement is impatience. Sitting a funnel or bedding transition feels risky when nothing is happening. Moving feels like progress. But in reality, constant movement usually means constant disruption. Elk sense that pressure and tighten up even more. When you commit to position over movement, your hunts slow down, but your opportunities sharpen. You see elk before they see you. You force encounters instead of reacting to them. And instead of exhausting yourself trying to keep up with elk decisions, you let terrain narrow those decisions until only a few options remain. That's how consistent encounters are built, quietly, deliberately, and ahead of the elk. Once you stop chasing elk and start hunting terrain, your setups become more intentional instead of reactive. Terrain based setups aren't about getting close to where elk were last seen. They're about placing yourself where elk are likely to show themselves because terrain leaves them few better options. High percentage glassing points are a good example. The best glassing locations aren't always the highest knobs or the widest views. They're positions that let you see into terrain elk prefer to move through without exposing yourself. Benches below rims, timber edges where cover meets open feed, side hills that allow you to glass across travel routes instead of straight down into them. Those positions work because they align with elk movement, not because they look impressive on a map. Wind and thermals are also terrain-driven systems, not random variables. But terrain dictates how clean or chaotic those systems are. Broken terrain creates swirls. Long, consistent slopes create predictable flow. Elk choose bedding and travel routes that give them the best wind advantage within that system. Your setups need to respect that or they'll fail before the elk ever show up. Seeing without being seen is another terrain advantage that gets overlooked. Positioning below skylines, using folds in the ground, and setting up just off the edge of cover allows you to observe movement while staying hidden. Elk pick up silhouettes faster than motion. Terrain that breaks outlines buys you time to observe, plan, and act deliberately instead of rushing a bad move. Entry and exit routes are often the reason good hunts blow up. Hunters focus on where they want to sit but ignore how they're going to get there. Crossing open slopes, walking ridges that elk use as travel corridors, dropping straight into basins without considering thermals. Elk often detect hunters during approach or exit, not during the sit itself. Good terrain-based setups include hidden access routes that avoid crossing prime elk space. The best setups solve multiple problems at once. They respect wind, they minimize exposure, they sit on movement that terrain forces, and they allow you to stay put longer or long enough for elk to make a mistake. When you consistently build setups this way, success is going to feel less chaotic. You're no longer relying on perfect timing or loud rut activity. You're creating situations where elk eventually have to move through your window on their terms, but within terrain that finally favors you. When you start viewing elk hunting through a terrain first lens, e-scouting stops being about finding where the elk are and becomes about identifying where elk can consistently solve their problems. That shift alone makes your map work more focused and far more productive. On maps, you're no longer just circling feed or marking random glassing points. You're looking for terrain features that repeatedly offer security, efficiency, and escape. Benches below rims, side hills with broken cover, saddles that connect bedding to feed without exposure, timbered fingers that allow quiet travel. These features stand out once you know what you're trying to prove on the ground. This approach also lets you build multiple plays before season instead of relying on a single honey hole. An A plan might be a primary bedding complex with multiple access routes and good wind options. A B play might be a lower elevation pressure refuge that only turns on once hunters push elk down. Plan C might be a subtle travel corridor that doesn't hold elk all day but consistently produces short movement windows. All of those are terrain based, not activity based. E-scouting with intention also speeds up ground truthing. Instead of wandering around hoping to bump into elk sign, you're testing specific assumptions. Is this bench actually secure? Does the wind behave the way the map suggests? Can elk move through this saddle without exposing themselves? Even when you don't see elk, you're gathering information that confirms or eliminates terrain plays pretty quickly. This is especially important during the season. Time is limited, pressure is real. Hunters who understand terrain can adapt faster because they're not emotionally tied to one spot. If pressure shifts, they already know which terrain features nearby are most likely to absorb or hide elk. They move with purpose instead of panic. Terrain based e scouting also prevents overmoving. When you've already identified high percentage terrain, you're more willing to sit, glass, and let the hunt develop. You trust the system instead of chasing every new track or sound. In future episodes, we're going to break this down even further with detailed map examples, how to identify microterrain, how to layer wind and pressure into e-scouting, and how to build season-long plans that don't fall apart when conditions change. When terrain becomes your foundation, planning gets simpler, decisions get faster, and confidence replaces guesswork long before opening day. When you zoom out and look at successful elk hunts over time, the pattern becomes pretty clear. The elk weren't doing anything extraordinary, even though they are extraordinary animals. The hunters weren't relying on perfect timing or nonstop rut activity, even though that's great, helpful, and fun. They were consistently putting themselves in terrain that forced elk to make predictable decisions. That's the reframe. Stop trying to predict elk behavior and start predict terrain choices. This is something you can apply immediately on your next hunt. Slow down and ask better questions. Where can elk bed with wind and security? What terrain connects those beds to feed without exposure? Where does pressure naturally push elk instead of pushing them out of the unit? Those answers are already written into the ground. When you hunt those places, you stop burning energy, chasing movement, and start creating your encounters. The most common mistakes to avoid are the same ones that trap average hunters year after year. Overmoving when things get quiet, chasing bugles instead of positioning ahead of them, ignoring microterrain because it doesn't look impressive on a map, and walking right through prime elk space during your approach or exit without realizing it. Terrain punishes those mistakes quietly but consistently. Now, if you're serious about taking all of this kind of knowledge deeper, that's exactly why I built Team Backbone. It's more than a membership, it's a way to sharpen your edge with proven systems, scouting tools, and a community of hunters who refuse to quit. Inside, you're going to get 20% off site wide, a member only t shirt shipped to your door every month, full access to the digital content vault with training, checklists, and backcountry strategy, a private Facebook group with direct access to me, and even direct call, text, or email access to me when you need help making decisions in real time. You're also automatically entered into monthly gear giveaways. This is built for hunters who want clarity instead of chaos and confidence instead of guesswork. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.